Listen, it's not as good as last week where we were rocking out on John's phone, but it still sounds good to have the slow jams on crystal clear audio, doesn't it, Jenny?
It'll do. It'll do. Good morning, Brant.
Good morning, Jenny.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Jenny Noonan-Dye. I'm joining you from Provo, Utah. By my side, as always, is my husband, John Dye. And joining us, of course, is my good friend and co-host for the Mormon News Report podcast, all the way from Detroit, Michigan, a couple time zones away, Brant Malone.
All the way. But I am here this week. A big thank you to our buddy, friend of the News Report, Ben Bernard, for stepping in last week. Jenny, it was one of those weeks where I'm not kidding you. Every 2 hours I had something, whether it was come follow me or having to teach priests the quorum or then having to present at 8 is great or something. So a very big thank you to you and Ben for stepping in. I listened. I'm going to get the audio posted here probably tonight. It was a great discussion. Go figure. That Ben Bernard's guy, he's got he might have a career in this whole virtual Sunday school thing. I might have to start being threatened because he was so good.
He was very good. He should consider doing things like public speaking or teaching the gospel.
Right. Or maybe like talking to youth or motivational speak or something like that. Anyways, he was great. He was really awesome.
We're really grateful. Thanks again, Ben, for doing that. And I'm glad that it worked out, because sometimes we have things going on and it makes it so that it's not as easy to do this Come Follow Me Sunday School lesson. But we like to do it every week. We like to do it on Sundays at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, 11 a.m. Eastern. And, that might change. It has changed throughout since we've been doing it since March.
We are a church of continuing revelation. Things change all the time, and that includes the Mormon News Report, Come Follow Me, virtual Sunday school. So, Jenny, I have to ask you, as you had a chance to look over some of Ether this week, this is kind of an interesting part of the Book of Mormon, because we're seeing this mixture of what's going on in Ether, but also a lot of Moroni's commentary. And it was, if you're looking at it from a narrative standpoint in the Book of Mormon, a few things happened, but I can't really say that like we have major developments. But that's not to say that it wasn't a really, really good part of Scripture, because we get some pretty deep discussions on the whole idea of faith and what that means. Did you get that impression as well?
Yeah, it's not like there was some, like you said, not necessarily an event per se that we can turn to and say, remember when this happened, other than the very important principles that are taught, which I think is applicable to life in general, right? It's not all the time that we are, experiencing things like visitations from angels or having to take everything we love into the wilderness. Yet, daily, we are faced with opportunities, with situations where we can choose to exercise faith or not. So
you're absolutely right. Like I think that we could look at the Book of Ether, and there might be a couple of things that stand out. The brother of Jared with the finger of the Lord, and maybe the destruction of the entire Jaredite people at the very end of the Book of Ether. But it's not like a lot of people are looking at Ether 12 saying, hey, remember when this happened? But that's not to say that there wasn't some really good stuff there. A few hellos for people checking in. Yes. Good morning to Laurel from Mesa, to Randall from Heber, to Ordine from Idaho Falls, to Elder Mongu from the Democratic Republic of Congo, serving in the Kenya Nairobi mission. Elder Mongu, I hope that we can give you something of spiritual fulfillment. I almost think that you should probably be teaching us, but that's neither here nor there. Bob and Sandy joining us in. Chris, I love this. Good morning from the world's best corn dogs in Las Vegas, which, listen, if you want to sell me on Las Vegas, that's one way to do it. Just tell me it's got the world's best corn dogs. Annette from Delano, California. Sheila from the Philippines. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Thank you for checking in. But Jenny, yeah, like what we were saying, there was some pretty in-depth stuff on the whole idea of faith. And faith is something that we talk about as being a very foundational part of the gospel. It's one of the things that we talk about when it's the very basics of what we teach all kinds of people. Like, you've got to have faith before you can move anywhere else. At the same time, I almost wonder if, because it is so foundational, because it's something that we've tried to take and distill it down so we could teach it to people who've been in the church for a long time, but also children, people joining the church and hearing the gospel for the first time. I wonder, and I'm going to throw this out there, I wonder if we don't take faith as seriously because we've distilled it down to a few sentences here and there. It's the evidence of things not seen. Okay, check. Yep, got it. I got faith. But I think what Moroni is trying to say here is it is so much more than just haven't seen it, believe it. Okay, I'm good.
Yeah, I think it does kind of become it can become a trope that we talk about faith and belief interchangeably, and they just aren't. And this is, these chapters, that's where we get the definition that John just showed a pretty clever visual of. This it's like an eye chart, but faith is things which are hoped for and not seen. That's different. There, if you think about belief and hope, those are different. And while faith certainly does involve belief, I would say it probably more involves hope.
That's interesting. So, let me find a few more of our friends checking in, and I want to ask you about that difference between faith and belief. So good morning to Stephanie from South Dakota. Deborah from Detroit. Hey, I'm only about an hour north of you. I am in Oakland County. Barbara from Orem, and Bella from Guyana. So, Jenny, you made a distinction between faith and belief. And I think sometimes we think that the other, but in your mind or the way that you're setting it out there is a difference between the two. And it sounds like your hypothesis, if you will, is that sometimes we conflate the two to think that one equals the other. But are you making the claim that they're two different things that we should be thinking about when it comes to faith and belief?
Well, they're just not interchangeable the way that we can tend to use them. I think it's really pertinent that, especially in Ether 12, that we find that we find a lot of examples of people exercising faith, and I feel like that might be one of the differences when we talk about faith and belief, because I don't know that we exercise belief, right? When we talk about faith and we talk about exercising faith, with exercise being the verb, we've talked a lot about this before, I think, just kind of in more general terms, but this might be the time to delve into it more deeply. When you exercise, what you're doing is you are repeatedly building muscle. You are repeatedly building endurance or strength or whatever your goals are. It's a long-term journey. Exercise is. I think you've mentioned before, Brant, you can't just expect to go do a couple curls and be like, okay, I'm ready for the bodybuilding competition. That's not how it works. And similarly with faith, when we have an experience where we are required to, or we choose to exercise our faith, that leads to a lot of things. I actually, as I'm saying it, that could be likened to the physical exercises that we do too. I mean, it can lead to being sore. It can lead to being tired, but it can also lead to progression. Oftentimes, progression that we don't see evidence of until much, much later, and many repetitions or days, weeks, months of that exercise.
That's really interesting, because if you think about the whole idea of using weights to build muscles, or by going running to build your endurance, you might not, because the improvements are going to be so incremental. it almost requires you to look back and say, you know what, before I did this, I couldn't even walk down to the end of my street without being winded. And now I can run a mile and I could probably still go for a little bit more. But you don't see that in the moment. And I really like your idea that faith is active. Laurel actually says faith is energy. And I like that as well. There's this whole notion that almost in a sense, belief is passive, but to have faith takes an active, a proactive measure on your part to make sure that you are exercising it, that you are utilizing it. I think about this story that Truman Madsen tells about Joseph Smith, and it was either Oliver Cowdery or Sidney Rigdon, and they had this marvelous spiritual experience. And afterwards, they came out of this experience, and Joseph and his counterpart, whichever one it was, saw some early members of the church. And the way that it was described was Joseph looked full of energy, looked alive and brilliant and things like that. And either Sidney or Oliver, I can't remember which one it was, looked white as a ghost, looked like he had been drained of his energy. And someone said, what happened to him? And this is all paraphrasing, but Joseph said, he's not as used to it as I am. And I think that that's something to be considered too when we are exercising that faith. If we're not used to that concentrated energy that we have to exert, we might not be used to it. And I think about things like missionaries that have been put in positions where they need to harness all that energy that they have, that spiritual energy, to utilize it for various reasons. Yeah, it can be exhausting. And when you're not used to it, it could wear you down. Yeah,
for sure. That's absolutely true. I like that Ordine shares faith can start as belief. I think that's absolutely true and significant here because they're not without each other, right? I want to jump into Ether chapter 12, right in verse 4, when we learn about Ether being the prophet and he crying unto the people day and night. In verse 4 it says, "Wherefore whoso believeth in God might with surety hope for a better world, yea, even a place at the right hand of God, which hope cometh of faith, maketh an anchor to the souls of men, which would make them sure and steadfast, always abounding in good works, being led to glorify God." And then down in verse 6 is where we get Moroni's explanation. He says, "And now I, Moroni, would speak somewhat concerning these things. I would show unto the world that faith is things which are hoped for and not seen. Wherefore dispute not, because ye see not, for ye receive no witness until after the trial of your faith. For it was by faith that Christ showed himself unto our fathers, after he had risen from the dead, and he showed not himself unto them until after they had faith in him. Wherefore it must needs be that some had faith in him, for he showed himself not unto the world. But because of the faith of men, he has shown himself unto the world, and glorified the name of the Father, and prepared a way, that thereby others might be partakers of the heavenly gift, that they might hope for these things which they have not seen." Excuse me. So, as we're thinking about that, as we think about how, and we also learn too in this chapter about how the blessings that we receive can be tied to the faith that we have. We need to be careful about that because, as we've discussed before, prosperity gospel, but there is a true principle in that for sure. What are your thoughts on that, Brant?
There was something that stood out in verse, I believe it was, I'm trying to look right now. It was verse 7. And it's something that I hadn't considered even as I was studying this section of scripture today. I hadn't even considered it. But in verse 7, "For it was by faith that Christ showed himself unto our fathers," which, okay, after he had risen from the dead, and he showed not himself unto them until after they had faith in him. So it's interesting to say that he wasn't going to show himself until after they had faith. And I keep coming back to this discussion we're having about faith versus belief. And I'm glad that Ordine said that faith can start as belief. I don't want to make it sound like I'm denigrating someone who has belief, but I think it's important to draw this distinction. I'm sure there were quite a few people that believed that Christ would return, that Christ would show himself in the flesh after he died, after he was resurrected. But it's interesting that he only showed it to those who had faith. And I think that that is probably an important thing for us to remember. There is something to be said there about this whole act of having faith and proceeding there. And I guess I didn't even think about the fact that, no, it wasn't just people who believed, but it's the people who had faith in him. So what is the difference there? And I'm glad that we're talking about it, because it's probably something that we as members of the church, if this is a foundational principle of our gospel, that we should probably be thinking a little bit deeper about, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but not resorting to maybe one or two sentence phrases to talk about a very complex subject that I still don't think that we fully understand.
For sure we don't. I think, there are times when we have faith because of things that we've studied, but also we have faith because of other people's experiences, right? When you pointed out in verse 7, it was by faith that Christ showed himself unto our fathers, and not until after they had faith in him. It makes me just kind of begin to consider the role that our faith and things that we've experienced has on others. I guess the simplest terms would be, children having faith in what they are taught by their parents, by their experiences. And at what point, or I guess many points, does it turn from having faith in someone else's experience to having your own faith? And maybe that is a distinction between faith and belief.
Well, and I keep going back to this idea of the gifts of the Spirit. And I'm trying to look it up right now on the fly. I think it's D&C 46. But there's part of the gifts of the Spirit where they talk about, for some it is given to have faith, and for some it is given to believe the faith of others. I'm completely paraphrasing it here. But that distinction has always stood out to me, because I think that we can probably make it a goal to have that faith. But I think also that we think that for some people, their gift of the Spirit is to believe the faith of others, or have the faith of others be a defining moment for them. And so, yes, you're right. In things like, I look at my children, I look at your children. Yep, that plays a factor. If you're a missionary, potentially to say, hey, maybe the people that I'm teaching, my faith is something that will be a benefit to them. And maybe their gift during this time period is to believe in my faith, or have that to be a part of them. But I wonder if it's other things too. We look at our church leaders. I'm sure that plays a factor. We could all look at the faith of someone like President Nelson and say, yeah, that's something that I could believe in his faith. But at the same time, how many of us have had just a marvelous teacher, ward or stake leader, Relief Society president, Relief Society teacher, to say, wow, I wish I could have that level of faith. Or, and this is something that I've experienced a little bit, Jenny, and I'm not sure if you or John have experienced this either, to have this experience of, you know what, I'm going through a really tough time. There's some things about the church that I'm not exactly sure. But you know what? I can look to someone like John, and I know that John knows some of these things, and he can retain his faith in the church. So maybe there's something there for me. And John and Jenny, I'm not sure if you've ever had that happen. I've had that happen to me, where I've had some people tell that to me. And that can be intimidating, because you realize the weight that you have now on your shoulders.
Absolutely. By the way, Jenny had to run off for 1 second. She'll be right back. But Brant, I can't agree with you more. Oftentimes we have to look to the faith of others, right? Especially when we're impressionable as youngsters. I mean, so much of our current lives are influenced because of what our parents did, right? And the faith that they felt. My mom was a convert to the church in college. My father, his gosh, he's a third generation member. First generation within this small area of Montana where we grew up, and 2 missionaries went through the valley, and because of an exceptional vision that his great grandmother had, I guess, joined the church. And so, as we look toward those stories, that's the power, I believe, one of the powers of family history, of reading those and feeling the strength that others had, which then give us the power to move on. One interesting thing, and I brought this up for a moment just before, but one interesting thing that I love to think about, and I love the analogy of, hope is an anchor. Hope is not created without faith. We have to have faith, which then creates the hope, but then it creates an anchor to the soul. I love that analogy. I love that visual that it gives us, because what an anchor does is it creates this sure foundation, kind of tying back into Helaman 5:12, right? The firm foundation that upon which we must build. An anchor keeps something sure and stable. And if we don't have that hope that comes from faith, then we are easily moved, right? We talk about the whirlwinds and the fiery darts that are sent to us by the devil or by Satan, by Lucifer. If we have hope, which is created by faith, it creates an anchor to our souls. And I think that's a really nice visual that is given to us in Helaman 12, or excuse me, Ether 12.
And it's interesting when you think about the analogy of an anchor, because if you were on a still lake, well, there wouldn't really need to be an anchor. You might get moved a little bit here and there, but you're probably going to stay in the same place. An anchor is beneficial when you're dealing with an active body of water, and most bodies of water are active. And so you need that. And so it leads into a little bit of what's going on in Ether 12:6, where Moroni says, "And now I, Moroni, would speak somewhat concerning these things. I would show unto the world that," and this is something that we all know, "faith is things which are hoped for and not seen." But this is the interesting part. "Wherefore, dispute not because ye see not." And this is one that I think is something that we all know, but I don't know if we've really talked about it that much or really dug into it. "For ye received no witness until after the trial of your faith." And so if we go back to this analogy of the anchor is not going to be useful unless there are forces working against the boat. The anchor is useful when there are waves and things that are trying to push the boat. And so, John, the question that I have, and Jenny and I were talking about this a little bit, we talk about this whole notion of weights and working out, but this idea that we can't utilize faith or we won't really have a witness of our faith until after it has been tried. And that could be a little intimidating, wouldn't you say?
Hi, it's me again. Yes, and I wanna thank you, John, for covering. I had to step away for a second. I am so grateful that you said what you did about faith being an anchor, because we've talked about faith being a lot of things. We've talked about the exercise of faith being an anchor. Someone mentioned faith is energy. We sure have a lot of sayings about faith is, right? Faith is a seed. Faith precedes the miracle. All these things, right? And I do want to get to Ben's comment in a second, but I want to talk about what you said, John, and what Brent said. I think it's really not uncommon for us to hear that, like that we need faith as our anchor, and if we don't, then we run the risk of becoming lost, of being unanchored, getting lost at sea. All those analogies. And so when I heard you say that, I actually was like taken back to a time in my life when I remember hearing that and being like, oh my gosh, my faith isn't enough. My faith isn't sufficient. So I guess I just want to talk for a couple minutes about what we can do to move toward having the faith that we think we ought to have, moving from belief to faith. And that's where I think we need to, I think that the exercise analogy is perfect also, because if you walk into a gym or a fitness center or a rec center or even a store to get your own weights or whatever, because you want to you want to build strength, or you get your shoes on, you lace them up and you step outside because you want to build endurance, you're not going to get to the heaviest things first. You're not going to run a marathon immediately. And I'm just a real strong believer in the idea that 5-pound weights, 2-pound weights are really helpful. And so I guess as you were talking, John, I just had the thought, can we make our anchors stronger? If we think about like the visual of an anchor, it is what it is. There, John just pulled up an image of it. It says, why is an anchor important to a boat? How is hope an anchor to the souls of men? And those things are important. We can have an anchor if we find ourselves, I guess is what I'm saying, if we find ourselves in a spot where our anchor isn't as heavy or as chiseled or as strong or defined as we would prefer.
Hold on. Are we talking about real anchors, or are we talking about John Dye? Because this could go either way with that one.
Chiseled is the adjective of choice.
You're welcome. I was just thinking, the shape. But anyway, we can make our anchors stronger. I mean, that is what the exercise of faith does. So I guess I'm mainly talking to anyone who may be hearing this, who feels. I don't want you to feel any sort of sense of, well, I don't know that I could consider my faith an anchor because it isn't strong enough, and I don't want there to be any sort of lack of hope in that for you, because it is a journey, and we can develop our faith over our life.
And before we get to Ben's comment, I just want to add on to your analogy, Jenny, because I know that you and John and I, we've got a lot of experience going to the gym, working out. In my situation, a lot of experience of starting and stopping and starting and stopping. But one of the things that is so important when you're beginning on this journey is to make sure that, and I'm speaking of this from I'm not a physical trainer, but from what I've heard physical trainers talk about, what you don't want to do is get someone who hasn't been to the gym in a while and max them out right then, right there. Because what you're going to find is the next day, you're going to feel awful. And you're not going to be able to do what you think you could do on the timeline that you're doing it. And that's why one of the things that I've heard physical trainers say is, even if all you can do is get into the gym and lift a 5-pound weight, that's better than nothing. That's okay. And you know what? And working at it, and the gradual, which will lead into Ben's comment here, which is really good. The gradualness is what does it for us. Someone like President Nelson, or someone like the brother of Jared, Coriantumr, did not get to the point where they had the faith to see the finger of the Lord overnight. That was a long, long journey. And sometimes there were probably great days, and I know we've all had it, whether you run or lift weights or whatever you do, where you think, I could take on the world. And some days, and I've had this happen quite a bit over the last little bit because of school and a bunch of other stressors that I've got going on in life. To be honest, it's just enough to be able to walk into the gym and say, I'm here. Mm-hmm. And think about it in the context of the gospel and church. Sometimes it might just be enough for us to get on our knees and say, Lord, I'm here and I'm having a hard time. Sometimes it might be enough for us just to set foot or to sit in the parking lot of a church. And that's why I think, Jenny, you and I are so passionate about making sure that we never, ever, 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 ever judge someone's journey that they're on when it comes to the church. We've talked about there is more than one way to Mormon. One of the reasons why we do that is because we're not a homogenous people, but at the same time, we never, never know the burdens and the journey that someone else is on. So I'll turn it over to you so we can get to Ben's comment.
No, thank you so much. That's absolutely, I think you covered a lot of really great pertinent things there. Excuse me. Ben, thank you so much for what you shared. And for those who participated in last week's lesson, and Brant, when you share that audio, people will know, right before we began recording last week, Ben was so excited to get into Ether 12. And I was like, I think that's next week. And so I'm glad that he took the time to generously type this out and share with us. He says, I love the analogy of physical exercise in regards to faith. It has made the most sense to me as I've tried to walk along God's path. Years ago, I decided I was sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I decided to try to learn how to be healthier, lose weight, learn how to run, lift weights, all those things. I knew nothing about exercise, and I had horrible habits to overcome. I would get frustrated that I couldn't lose weight in a week, and all my previous efforts seemed fruitless. But I saw some good examples from those around me. I read some good words from people who had been on a similar journey, and deep inside, something told me that if I just tried what they did and patiently stuck with a program and kept picking myself up when, not if, but when I failed and faltered, maybe, just maybe, I would get results like they did. In essence, I believed in some far-off goal that I couldn't yet see, but I had faith that if I gave it an honest shot, I would get there. So I gave it a shot, and the results didn't come overnight, not by a long shot. But after that first week of consistent effort, when I saw the baby tender shoots of success starting to poke through the proverbial soil, I realized that just maybe it was working. So I kept going, and the results kept coming. And once I reached my physical goal, I was finally able to say for myself that I knew that the exercise could work, whereas before I only had faith that it could work. So now I try the same process repeatedly in spiritual matters, like the counsel in Alma 32, when we plant the word in our souls, when we try to nourish by faith the gospel in our lives, we have to be patient that it will bear good fruits. Thank you, Ben, for sharing that. And I think that's so important. You know, I've long maintained that one of the most frustrating aspects of just our human existence is the passage of time, and our inherent sometimes impatience. We want what we want when we want, and it's now is when we want it. So having to wait and be patient is helpful in building our faith, and to tie it back to the previous few weeks when we've talked about the importance of keeping records and keeping journals. That is one way to track our progress for sure. I know I've found journals from when I was young, when I was a child or a teenager, and I would read even my testimony and just the things I had a testimony of then. It's not that they've changed, but they certainly have evolved. They're not the same. And to see that progress, that path has been helpful. I like what John just brought up here, this image of President Eyring. Those who do not see their weaknesses do not progress. And this is very important. This might be the quote of the week. Your awareness of your weakness is a blessing, as it helps you remain humble and keeps you turning to the Savior. And I like that a lot. I think that's an integral part of this lesson, because as this other image, Jesus Christ can make weak things strong. It's our choice, as we are aware of our weaknesses, where we turn with that, and turning to the Savior, those weaknesses can be made into strengths. Not always as quickly as we would prefer, but certainly that He is the source. He is the source for where we get strength and where we learn how to continually become better.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great way to think about it too. If we don't have the capability to look back or to see our own weaknesses, number one, I think that says something about your personality. You might want to talk to a professional, because that sounds a little bit like a narcissist. But at the same time, like, that's part of being human. One of the things that I do professionally is I work on process improvements, and it's always stunning to me when I talk with teams sometimes, and usually it's when we're doing what we call a postmortem, to say, all right, so what's one thing that we could have done better? And even if you have a flawless execution of something, it is always stunning to me that sometimes you will find someone who goes, yeah, nothing better we could have done. It was perfect. And for me, that is a giant red flag to say, no. We need to start digging into that, because if you're telling me that everything was perfect, then you should be running this company, because that's not the case. And I think that's the same in the church. If you were to talk to someone like a President Eyring, he'd probably tell you, yeah, I've got these weaknesses, but this is the point. This is the reason why we work on it. And I know that we're running short on time, but speaking of weaknesses, and I know that, John, this is something that you and I were talking about before we started recording. So I hate to grab the steering wheel, Jenny, and make a sharp left turn. But speaking of weaknesses, we see a little bit of this coming out in Moroni, because what we're getting is his commentary on a lot of things, And as we're seeing all this explanation on faith, we start to see a little bit of his personality. And as much as we want to rightly bring up Moroni as a very strong, someone that we should look up to, he's also very introspective on, frankly, some of his own shortcomings.
Right. Absolutely. And John, is that the same thing that you and I were talking about earlier?
Yeah, kind of this imposter syndrome, right? I think, sorry, I'm trying to figure out where it begins, but basically, he talks about the brother of Jared here in 21, all of these things. And he said, he's going to, Lord, the Gentiles will mock at these things because of our weakness in writing. For the Lord has made us mighty in word by faith, but thou hast not made us mighty in writing, for thou hast made all this people that they could speak much because of the Holy Ghost, which thou hast given them. So consider this for a moment. Moroni probably had a lot of Mormon's genes, right? He was his dad. These were strong and mighty men, right? At the age of 15, he was basically, Mormon was told he would be basically the general in the Nephite armies. At 16, he became that. So think about this, that the plates they were not an innumerable resource, right? There were only certain number of plates that they could write on. So if you didn't etch those correctly, if you had big hands, which he probably did, it made that very hard. The stylus or the engraver with which he worked, all of those things I think would have been really, really tough to work with. And as you think about that, it probably caused him some anxiety, some concern, different things that were causing. So I consider that, an imposter syndrome. He basically was saying, should I be doing this? Should I be, am I the best person suited to finish these plates and actually bury them up? And I just brought up, as we look at imposter syndrome, this is the definition. Jenny, do you want to read it?
Sure. And it's something that I think we can all relate to, even if we've never heard the phrase, but it's a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. The reason John and I talked about that this morning is because, I shared with you, Brant, that it's been a rough week, and sometimes when I'm feeling really low, I tend to be more susceptible to imposter syndrome, and I didn't get to study very much this week, and so I mentioned that to John, and John said, well, there are these verses that that we could discuss, and just the fact that he excuse me, knew that off the top of his head, and and I'm like, I don't know the scriptures as well. Like almost every single week, I feel a measure of imposter syndrome about this very thing, this come follow me lesson. And so I was really worried today about that, because I thought, I don't know that I'm not going to burst into tears because of something that's really weighing heavily on me. One of my dearest friends passed away a couple of days ago, and it is just intensely unfair. In a week, in a time, in a season when we are supposed to be showing and expressing gratitude, and just feeling that way, I was like, I don't know if I want to log on today and feel like out of the three of us, I'm the one that's supposed to be leading the discussion, and I'm the one that knows the least. But it was very validating to then go over this and be like, oh my gosh, like Moroni felt the same thing. We all feel the same thing. And like I always say, one of the hardest parts of any sort of feeling that we have is that the feeling that we're alone in it can only exacerbate the pain. So if anyone out there is feeling like an imposter or a fraud, or that any day now people are going to figure out that you don't know what you're talking about, just know that you're not alone in it. You're in good company, at least with Moroni.
One of the things that we've talked about on the News Report podcast is the value of having leaders where we can see their humanness. And we've seen a bit of a shift in a transition. I would say maybe about 20 or 30 years ago, and maybe even longer, we have this view that our leaders were almost superhuman. That there's a joke that goes around that is Catholics believe the Pope to be infallible, but nobody believes it, whereas Mormons believe the prophet to be fallible, but nobody believes it. Because for a long time, our culture has been, look at these amazing men and women who are leading our church for good reason, for absolutely good reason, because they are amazing individuals. At the same time, what that does is that brings up this environment of we don't really see the humanness, and sometimes the humanness is much more valuable. And as we've talked about, we've seen some of our leaders, such as Richard G. Scott, very open about how difficult it was when his wife passed away and how hard that was. We saw that with President Hinckley and his wife passing away. We had someone like Elder Holland get up and talk about depression. We've had individuals who are leading the church now who are showing their human side. And the benefit of showing that human side is it allows us to connect a little bit more. It is not a situation where we look at ourselves and see the inadequacies, but it is a situation where we can look at them with their inadequacies and say, if God could do this with them, what can he do with someone like me? And that's why I'm so glad that this part of the Book of Mormon was included, and we get this commentary from Moroni, because it is valuable. Jenny, you're an example of that. I cannot imagine. I can't imagine how hard this week has been, because we've had similar tragedies, similar unfair tragedies, and there is the only thing that you can do is just mourn with those that mourn, because frankly it sucks. And the amazing part about the scriptures, the benefit of the scriptures, is to not just see the good, nourishing words that are in there, but to see situations like this where we can say, oh, when Nephi's father passed away, we saw the mourning that he had, and it was recorded in the scriptures. When Moroni is writing these things down, and as John said, maybe he's not as polished as his father. Maybe he's got big old bear mitts, right? That he's trying to write this stuff, and he's not doing a good job. And he's saying, he's trying to tell the Lord, I'm worried that this is not going to fall with the weight that it needs to fall. And that's where God can step in and say, hey, I got you. When Joseph Smith is going through and saying, I don't even have an education, and you're wanting me to do what? That to me is the amazing part. And when you think about how faith plays into all that, it's almost as if with all of our imposter syndromes that we had in various degrees, that we can turn it over, and the faith says, I know that I've got this, but I know that you can help me. So let's work together. And I think that is one of the more beautiful parts of the scriptures and of the gospel in general. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. I want to, can you pull that one up again, please? Because that's, yeah, this from President Hinckley. Please don't nag yourselves with thoughts of failure. Do not set goals far beyond your capacity to achieve. Simply do what you can do in the best way you know how, and the Lord will accept your effort. I want to acknowledge, that we've gotten some really awesome comments shared here in the comment section about, thoughts about anchors, about, I really like how someone said, let's see, Randall said, the anchor doesn't work until you let go and let God, which, okay, that's anchor inception right there, because anchor is the faith, and the faith that the anchor will work to keep us anchored. I think that's great. And our friend, our elder friend who's serving in Kenya says, sometimes when we're talking about faith as an anchor, I also try to look at the chain which connects the anchor to the boat. We can consider the chains as our relationship with our Heavenly Father. If we do our best to keep it strong by prayer, reading scriptures, fasting, and sharing the truth, we will always feel ourselves able to develop our faith. And that's absolutely true. Those and an excellent point. Those links in the chain need to be strengthened, need to be checked on as they do their work as well. And as people are expressing their own experiences with faith, I'm really appreciative. I want to I guess wrap it up with this from Ether chapter 12. And as we kind of mentioned last week, I mean, the lesson this week is is chapters 12 through 15. And we really could just do, and we have done basically an entire lesson just on a little bit of 12. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. But here in Ether, chapter 12, verses 26 and 27, it says, "And when I had said this, the Lord spake unto me, saying, Fools mock, but they shall mourn, and my grace is sufficient for the meek, that they shall take no advantage of your weakness. And if men come unto me, I will show unto them their weakness. I give unto men weakness, that they may be humble, and my grace is sufficient for all men that humble themselves before me. For if they humble themselves before me and have faith in me, then will I make weak things become strong unto them." And I'm really grateful for that. I feel like a lot of us go through seasons or periods of time when our weaknesses seem to be magnified to ourselves, and that is an opportunity to accept this invitation from the Savior, to turn to him so that he can make our weaknesses, take them and turn them into strengths in a way that only he can do, because he knows us in a way that no one else does. And I am grateful for that.
I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you, Jenny. I know it's been a very difficult week, and I'm really appreciative that you were able to come on, because I think that by you sharing your experiences, even difficult experiences like that, I think it helps. And I know that you've been very open about a lot of the things that you've thought and felt over the years. And I could just tell you from people that have communicated with us that your openness has been a great anchor to them in similar situations. So thank you, Jenny. Thank you, John, for all the work behind the scenes. Thank you very much to all of our commenters and our live streamers. We really appreciate you guys. Next week, are we still doing Ether, or are we moving on to Moroni?
We're Moroni.
Next week, the lesson, it will be Sunday, December 6th. And it's Moroni chapters 1 through 6. It's called To Keep Them in the Right Way. And it's interesting because Moroni found himself in a position where he didn't know he was going to write this. He didn't think he would live this long, and he did. And so lucky us.
Yeah, this is an interesting part, because it's like, hey, here's a smorgasbord of a bunch of random thought I've got. So it'll be very interesting to see how we discuss that. So that is next week. Join us next week at 9 a.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Also, if you're interested, Jenny and I do a Mormon News Report podcast. It's cleverly named because we review Mormon news. So find us there at the same place that you get these podcasts, or just Google us, Mormon News Report. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, John. And we'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks.